Okay, in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the quilting of your Learn to quilt, especially for those of you who weren't in lesson 5 last week. So this quilt here is one that's already been quilted, but just to kind of demonstrate a little bit, if you're looking at sort of your instructions on page 7, you'll see what I've done is I've put a number of sort of red arrows for starting your stitch in the ditch quilting. So essentially what I do is I have you start, it's not quite in the middle because the nature of this quilt, we don't have a line that we can go down right the middle, but we'll go down this line, and then you'll see what we do is just a series of vertical lines working our way out in one direction. So if we look at the quilt, you can see I've got one end rolled up here because obviously when you've got a large quilt, it's very difficult to get it through the throat of your machine. So what we do, the reason why we do all these vertical lines in one direction is because once we've done sort of this first line down here, and then we go on to the next vertical line and the next vertical line, etc., etc., that allows you then, as you work your way to the right hand edge, you just keep unrolling and unrolling. And so all you're having to do is sort of move that rolled edge of the quilt. Every time you want to go back up to the top, you just slide it back up to the top. You work your way down with every line. And then after you've done sort of everything on this side of the quilt, you'll see from the next page of your instructions, essentially what you do is you turn the quilt around, right? So this, if we turn the instructions upside down, you'll see these are all the lines that you'll have done first. And then essentially because you turn the quilt around, you roll up that edge, and then you do all the vertical lines that way. And then what you're going to do is you're going to turn your quilt and you're going to do vertical lines this way and this way. So why do we do that? If we look at this from the back, because this one is already quilted, you see, like the log cabin block is a perfect example, okay? We did vertical lines, and then we turned our quilt and we did vertical lines. But essentially what that means is we've gone around every bit without having to do a line, pivot, turn the entire quilt on our sewing machine, pivot, turn the entire quilt, pivot. And so it's much easier to just do all of your quilting, stitch in the ditch quilting, as a series of vertical lines. So that is why we do that quilting the way that we do it. And then the one block that we do slightly different is your applique block, and you can see all I've done with this is just use the width of my foot just to sort of roughly follow the applique there. And I would do that as a minimum. Obviously you do that because you've done all the vertical seams, you also have done all the way around it. And that's going to be plenty of quilting. But if you really like the echo effect, what you can do after you've done the first line is use the width of your foot again to do another echo, and you can do as many as you want until you fill the whole area. But as a minimum, really that's all you need to do. Okay, so now I've got a quilt here that I'm ready to do some stitch in the ditch quilting on. Now some of your lines will be all the way from end to end, but what I'm going to do is show you some of the lines that are in the quilt. We're going to be doing this one here for starters. And so before we do anything, the first thing we want to do is we want to go over to our stitch length on our machine, and we want to change our stitch length to a very tight stitch. In this case with my machine, I'm going to do 0.5. If your machine won't do 0.5, if it does 0.4 or 0.6, set it to one of those. But we just need a small stitch for our locking stitch. So then what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the line of quilting that we want to do here. First thing we have to do with every single one of these lines is we need to pull our bobbin thread through the quilt to the top. The way to do that is just using the hand wheel on your machine, is drop the needle in while holding on to the top thread. That time it didn't work, so let's try it again. And just keep turning the hand wheel until the needle comes all the way into its highest position, and then you can just pull up on the bobbin thread and pull it all the way through the quilt. You'll need to practice it a few times because not everybody gets it first time. Once you've done that, you can just go ahead and drop your needle back in, and what we want to do is we want to do 8 or 10 locking stitches with this tiny stitch. So we just count off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm going to drop my needle in so that it stays put. And we're going to be doing our quilting along here. Our quilting stitch is going to be a longer stitch. I'm going to go back over to my stitch length here. I'm now going to set that at 2.5. Okay, now I'm ready to quilt. When you're doing stitch in the ditch quilting, there's always a high side and a low side to every seam that you have, because you always pressed your seam in one direction rather than open. We always want to stitch on the low side of the seam. So if you're not sure what's the low side of the seam, just run your fingernail on it. Where you feel the resistance is the high side. If you run your fingernail in the other direction, there's no resistance there. That's the low side. So I'm gonna now start doing my longer stitch, which is my quilting stitch. Every time you need to stop and reposition your hands, just do so. I do like to try and kind of hold things down a little bit, almost sort of pulling it away, so that my stitch in the ditch quilting, what you want to happen is when everything sort of relaxes again, that line of stitching will hopefully just kind of disappear in the ditch, so to speak. So we're just going to keep following that. I'm staying on the right side here, which is the ditch, as close as I can. If you go up over the high side, it's not the end of the world. So I'm getting close to where this line is going to end. I'm going to slow down a little bit as I get there. About 1/4 inch before I get to my stopping point, I am going to stop. I'm going to go back to my locking stitch over here, which was 0.5. And now I'm going to finish this off. Again, it should be about 8 or 10 stitches, give or take. Okay, so that is that line of stitching. Now, if you want to carry on and do another vertical line that is nearby, you can do that. You've got 2 choices. One is to stop here, cut your top thread, cut your thread underneath, and then just start again at this next point, pull up your bobbin thread and start as before. Another thing that you can do to save yourself a little bit of aggravation pulling up the bobbin thread every time is just jump over to your next spot. You've got it set at the locking stitch already, so all you've got to do is just count off your 8 or 10 locking stitches. Go back to your quilting stitch, which was 2.5. Now you can see with this one, okay, if I can feel the resistance here, so this is now the high side. So I'm going to follow on the left side, which is the lower side of the seam. Then again, as we're getting close to the end here, I'm going to stop about 1/4 inch-ish before I get to the end of that. I'm going to go back to my locking stitch, and I'm just going to finish that right to the end. Okay, so now at this point, I can cut this thread. I'll cut my bobbin thread underneath, which I've got a bunch of mess under there. Don't worry about that. I'll cut that later. And then you can also go through and you can cut that jump thread both at the top and underneath. Okay, so that's the quilting, and hopefully that's going to help you with your homework for this week.